The morning Victor Crow rode onto Black Ridge Ranch. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He simply dismounted at the fence line, walked straight past the ranch hands like they were fence posts, and threw a leather satchel onto the porch steps hard enough to send dust flying into Caleb Whitmore's boots. "You're 3 months behind on the water easement," Victor said. His voice was the kind of calm that made men nervous. Not loud, not shaking, just flat and certain, the way a cliff edge is certain. "I've redirected the creek. Every drop that runs through that eastern channel now runs through my land first." He smiled then, and it was the worst kind of smile. The kind worn by a man who has already won and simply hasn't told you yet. "You've got cattle dying and you don't even know it." Caleb stepped off the porch. "That creek has fed this ranch for 20 years. And now it feeds mine." Victor picked up his satchel, turned his back, and walked to his horse without another word. That was the moment everything changed. Not the drought, not the debt, not the men who'd been quietly leaving. It was that turned back, that absolute certainty that Caleb Whitmore was already finished, that broke something open in the air above Black Ridge Ranch and let in a cold that had nothing to do with the Wyoming wind. If you've ever watched someone take something from you and not even look back, you already know how this story ends. Or you think you do. Before we go further, if you're watching this for the first time, take a moment right now and subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because stories like Eleanor Voss's deserve to go everywhere. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about strength, about marriage, and about the kind of woman this frontier never saw coming. The train was 40 minutes late, which gave the men at Burnt Creek Station plenty of time to decide what kind of woman a man like Caleb Whitmore deserved. Russ Hadley, who ran the livery and considered himself an authority on most things, leaned against the post and scratched his jaw. "Heard she's from Chicago," he said. "Factory work. Could be anything." Denny Oakes, who was younger and stupider and proud of both, spit into the dirt. "Could be nothing's more like it. Man sends off for a wife like he's ordering a plow. What does he expect to get?" Nobody answered because the train whistle cut through and the platform filled with the noise of steam and metal grinding down. The passengers came off in a slow trickle. A family. A salesman with too many cases. A preacher who looked like he'd been argued out of 3 towns already. And then, last off because she'd helped an old woman down the narrow steps, Eleanor Voss. She was not what anyone expected. That much was immediately apparent. She was not small. She carried weight the way work puts it on a person. Evenly distributed, settled into the bones, not going anywhere. Her dress was clean but plain, brown wool that had been mended at the left cuff, and she wore her hair pulled back so severely it looked like a decision rather than a hairstyle. She was carrying a single bag, old and battered, and she carried it herself without any apparent interest in whether someone might offer to help. Denny Oakes laughed. He didn't even try to hide it. "Lord Almighty," he said under his breath, except it wasn't really under his breath, and the men near him heard it, and a few of them smiled, and that small cruelty rippled outward the way cruelties do on a slow afternoon with nothing better to do. Eleanor heard it. She heard all of it. Her expression didn't change by a single line. She stepped onto the platform, set her bag down, and looked around the station with the calm, methodical gaze of someone assessing a problem rather than arriving at a destination. Her eyes moved from the street to the buildings to the men lounging near the post, and when they landed on Caleb Whitmore, standing apart from the others, arms crossed, hat pulled down, she walked toward him without hesitation. Caleb hadn't moved. He'd been watching since she stepped off the train, his face giving away nothing, which was a skill he'd spent 41 years developing. She stopped in front of him. She was almost as tall as he was. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. Not a question. "Miss Voss." He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he's not sure about. Not unkind, but assessing. Train was late. "The coupling on the second car needed adjustment outside of Cheyenne," she said. "They handled it efficiently. We were only 40 minutes behind." She picked up her bag. "I assume the ranch is some distance from here." 6 miles. "Then we shouldn't waste more time." Caleb blinked. He'd expected a lot of things from this moment. Nervousness, awkward pleasantries, maybe tears. Women sometimes cried when they saw Wyoming for the first time. though he'd never quite understood why. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected her to be the one moving the conversation forward. He turned and walked to the wagon. She followed. Behind them, Denny Oaks said something else, quieter this time, and there was laughter. Eleanor did not look back. The 6 miles to Black Ridge Ranch were mostly silence, which suited both of them, though for different reasons. Caleb was running a private accounting in his head. Water, debt, men who'd left in the last 6 weeks, the conversation with Victor Crow 3 days ago that he still hadn't fully absorbed. Eleanor was looking at the land. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, carefully, without romance, noticing what was there rather than what she might want to see. The grass was thinning in the east field. The fence line needed new posts in at least 4 places she could count from the road. The creek bed that ran along the property edge was lower than it should be in August, though she didn't know enough about the region yet to know if that was unusual. She filed it all away. "How many hands?" she asked. Caleb glanced at her. "On the payroll or actually showing up?" "Both numbers." He was quiet for a moment. 11 on payroll, 7 reliable, 3 who show when it suits them. He paused. "And 1 I should have let go 6 months ago." "What's stopping you?" Another pause, longer. "He's been here since my father's time, and he's got the ear of the other men." Eleanor nodded slowly. She understood that problem. It wasn't really about the man. It was about the network he represented, the invisible loyalties that held a place together or tore it apart. "What's his name?" she asked. "Silas Crow." She said nothing to that, but her hands, which had been resting loosely in her lap, tightened slightly on the bag between her feet, just for a moment. Caleb didn't notice. Black Ridge Ranch was bigger than she'd imagined from the letters and smaller than she'd hoped. The main house was solid, built from timber and stone, the kind of structure that had been added onto over the years in ways that didn't quite match. A leaning porch extension, a new kitchen wing that hadn't been painted to match the rest. The yard between the house and the barn was packed dirt with a few stubborn clumps of grass trying to survive near the water trough. 3 ranch hands were leaning on the corral fence when the wagon pulled in. They straightened when they saw Caleb, then exchanged glances when they saw Eleanor. One of them, lean, mid-30s, with a face that had been weathered into something close to permanent suspicion, didn't bother to straighten. He stayed where he was, arms folded on the top rail, and watched Eleanor climb down from the wagon with the expression of a man watching something he'd already decided to find amusing. That was Silas. Eleanor knew it before anyone said a word. There's a type of man who makes himself the center of a room without moving, and she'd encountered that type before, in different forms, in different places. A factory floor in Chicago, a boarding house in Cincinnati, a courtroom in St. Louis that she tried not to think about too often. She picked up her bag and walked toward the house. "She's a big one," Silas said. Not quietly. The 2 men on either side of him made sounds that might have been laughs smothered into something less committal. Caleb said nothing, which told Eleanor something about the nature of the problem she was walking into. The inside of the house smelled like neglect wearing a thin coat of effort. Someone had tried to clean before she arrived. The floor had been swept, at least, but the surfaces in the kitchen were filmed with grease. The window above the dry sink was so dirty it gave the light a yellowish cast, and the smell coming from the pantry suggested that whatever had been left in there had been left there too long. A woman named Mrs. Hatch, who'd been cooking for the ranch since Caleb's wife died 4 years ago, met Eleanor in the kitchen doorway. Mrs. Hatch was 62 and made no effort to hide the fact that she resented this new arrangement. "Your room is at the end of the hall," she said. "Supper's at 6. "What are you making?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Hatch looked at her the way experienced women in domestic authority look at newcomers who ask the wrong kind of question. "Salt pork and biscuits, same as every Tuesday." Eleanor looked past her into the kitchen. She saw a pot that hadn't been cleaned properly. She saw flour with weevil evidence. She saw a shelf of preserves that had been improperly sealed, 2 jars already showing the telltale darkening around the lid. She said, "I'll take a look at the pantry before supper." "Suit yourself," Mrs. Hatch said, and moved aside with the controlled displeasure of someone who knows this is a battle they will win eventually. Eleanor went to her room first. She set her bag on the narrow bed and sat beside it for a moment, just breathing, letting the noise of the ranch come through the thin walls. Men's voices outside, the sound of boots on the porch, a horse making its displeasure known near the barn. She put her hand on the bag and felt the shape of what was inside it, the papers and the small leather pouch, and the things she'd been carrying for 11 months. She'd made it. She was here. That was the first thing. Everything else was still ahead. Supper that first night was a lesson in the architecture of a broken place. The ranch hands ate in shifts in a long, low room attached to the back of the barn that they called the bunkhouse dining room, which was a generous name for 4 tables pushed together under 2 lanterns that needed their wicks trimmed. Caleb ate at the main house, which Eleanor now understood was its own kind of isolation. The man sitting at the head of a table that was too big for one person, in a room that still had his wife's curtains on the windows. Eleanor ate with Caleb, which was apparently custom, and which neither of them had the energy to renegotiate on the first night. Mrs. Hatch brought out the salt pork and biscuits, and a bowl of greens that had been boiled long past the point of nutrition, and set them on the table with the precision of a woman performing a task rather than preparing a meal. The biscuits were heavy. The pork was oversalted and dry. Caleb ate without commenting, which either meant he had no taste left or he'd given up mentioning it. Eleanor suspected the latter. "The pantry has some problem jars," she said. "I'll tell Mrs. Hatch. 2 of them should probably be disposed of before they make someone sick. The seals failed." Caleb looked up from his plate. "You know preserves?" "I know what a failed seal looks like." She cut a piece of biscuit and ate it without flinching, though it required some effort. "I also know what this kitchen could be, given a few days and different supplies." Caleb was quiet for a moment, in the way he'd been quiet in the wagon, not dismissive, but measuring. "Mrs. Hatch has been here a long time." "I know. She was loyal to my wife." "I understand." Eleanor put down her fork. "I'm not trying to push her out. I'm telling you what I see. What you do with it is your decision." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, this woman who was supposed to solve his problems by being manageable, and for the first time since the train station, something shifted in his assessment of the situation. He wasn't sure yet what it shifted toward. He just knew it had moved. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" He thought about it with the seriousness the question apparently deserved. "Someone quieter." "I can be quiet," Eleanor said, "when there's nothing useful to say." She picked up her fork and finished her dinner. 3 days passed. She learned the ranch the way she'd learned every hard place she'd ever been, by moving through it steadily, watching before speaking, and making herself useful in ways that couldn't be easily dismissed. She started in the kitchen, which was the most immediate problem. On the second morning, she rose before Mrs. Hatch and found the state of the bread supply, which was near nothing, and what remained was going stale. She dug into her travel bag and found the paper-wrapped packet she'd tucked in the bottom. Starter culture she'd been carrying from Chicago, fed and kept alive through the entire journey in a small crock with a tight lid. She set it on the kitchen counter and began. Mrs. Hatch found her there at 6 in the morning with flour on her forearms and the kitchen smelling of something it hadn't smelled of in a long time. "What is that?" Mrs. Hatch said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "Bread." Eleanor didn't look up. She was working the dough with the kind of practiced efficiency that doesn't perform itself, just moves. "I make the bread here." "You were out of starter. The supply won't last another 2 days without it." Eleanor finally looked up. "This is yours to use when I'm done. I'm not taking over the kitchen. I'm solving a problem." Mrs. Hatch stood in the doorway for a long moment, then went to the stove to put on the coffee with the stiffness of a woman making an official decision to be offended later and nowhere near ready to admit a solution when she saw one. By 8 o'clock, the bread was baked and cooling. By 8:30, Caleb had come through the kitchen, stopped, and looked at the loaves with the expression of a man encountering something he'd forgotten existed. "Smells different," he said. "Different flour ratio, and I added a little molasses." Eleanor was already working on something else, sorting through the dried goods to inventory what was usable. The weevil problem in the flour barrel is in the top third. If you dump it out and clean the barrel today, the bottom 2/3 are fine. Caleb stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "All right," he said, and left. The problem with Silas Crow didn't wait politely for Eleanor to be ready for it. On the 4th day, she was crossing from the house to the root cellar with a list she'd made of what needed restocking, and she passed two of the hands repairing a section of fence near the water trough. Silas was standing nearby, not helping, supervising in the way that certain men supervise, by being present and critical. He saw her coming and said nothing. Let her pass. And then, when she was 3 steps past him, said it to the 2 men, but loud enough to carry, "She walks like a draft horse," which I guess is what the old man ordered. One of the men laughed. It was the kind of uncomfortable laugh that happens when people are afraid not to. Eleanor stopped. She stood still for a moment with her back to him. Then she turned around. "Say it to my face, Silas." The laughter died. The 2 fence hands became very interested in their fence. Silas looked at her with the slow confidence of a man who had never in his life been told to repeat himself by someone he'd publicly dismissed. He took his time before he said, "I said you walk like a draft horse." Eleanor walked back to him. She stopped at a distance that was closer than he expected, close enough that he'd have to back up to reclaim his territory, and he didn't back up, so now they were simply standing closer together than comfortable. She was nearly eye level with him. Nearly. "I've worked factory floors since I was 16 years old," she said. Her voice was level, not shaking, not performing, just talking. "I've lifted things that would put you in bed for a week. I have walked more miles in worse conditions than anything you've seen in this valley." She looked at him without blinking. "And I'm going to walk across this yard every single day for as long as I choose to live here. You can say whatever you want about how I do it, but I'm going to keep walking." She turned, picked up her list from where it had fallen, and went to the root cellar. Silas didn't say anything else. Not then. But the 2 fence hands looked at each other, and something passed between them that wasn't quite respect, not yet, but was the thing that comes before respect, the thing that makes respect possible. Surprise. Genuine, unplanned surprise at someone who turned out to be different than the story that had been told about them. That evening, Caleb came to find her. She was at the kitchen table with the ledger she'd asked to borrow, and a lamp turned up full, working through the household accounts, with the careful, methodical attention of someone who did not trust numbers to stay honest if you weren't watching them. He sat down across from her without being invited, which told her something about his state of mind. "Silas talked to me," he said. "I imagine he did." "He said you threatened him." Eleanor set down her pencil. "I told him I was going to keep walking across the yard. If he experienced that as a threat, that's an interesting admission." Caleb put his hands flat on the table. They were large hands, the hands of a man who had done physical work for most of his life, though they were also the hands of a man who'd spent the last decade holding paper and negotiating instead of gripping fence post. The calluses were old. "He's been here since my father built the East Barn," Caleb said. "He trained half my crew." "I know that. I didn't ask you to do anything." Eleanor picked up her pencil again. "I handled it myself." She looked at him. "Did he come to you with a complaint or a warning?" Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "Warning." "Then he's more worried about me than I need to be about him." She went back to the ledger. "These accounts. When's the last time someone went through the feed costs against the actual head count? There's a discrepancy in August that I can't reconcile." Caleb stared at her. Then, slowly he leaned forward and looked at the ledger. "Show me," he said. What neither of them said that night, working through the accounts by lamplight while the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds around them, was that something had shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way things shift in the stories men tell afterward. Just the small, practical shift of 2 people deciding, without discussing it, that the other person was worth paying attention to. Caleb found 2 places where the numbers didn't match. Eleanor found 3 more. By the time Mrs. Hatch came through to bank the kitchen fire, they had a list of 6 entries that needed investigation. "Feed supplier?" Eleanor asked. "Possibly," Caleb said. He was looking at the same column she was looking at, and his voice had the careful flatness of a man who's just seen something he should have seen 6 months ago. "Or someone between the supplier and here." Eleanor said nothing to that. She made a small mark in the margin. She knew about someone between a supplier and a destination. She knew more about that particular crime than almost anyone in Wyoming, but that knowledge had a time and a place, and this was not yet either. She closed the ledger and pushed it across the table. "I'll start on the supply list in the morning," she said. "The kitchen needs restocking before the end of the week." Caleb picked up the ledger. held it. Eleanor. She looked up. Why'd you come here? He wasn't asking it the way men sometimes ask that question, as a challenge or a dismissal. He was asking it the way a person asks something they actually want to know the answer to. To Wyoming, this ranch, why here? She held his gaze. She thought about the 11 months, about Chicago and the papers and the night. She'd sat in a boarding house in Cheyenne reading Caleb Whitmore's advertisement for the 4th time because she needed to be sure, needed to be certain this was the right place to be when the time came. Because I needed somewhere to be, she said, and I thought I might be useful here. It was true. All of it was true. It just wasn't all of the truth. Caleb nodded slowly. He seemed to accept it, or decide to accept it, one of those being the same as the other for the time being. He stood up and took the ledger. 6 in the morning, he said. I'll ride out with you to look at the creek line. The Eastern Channel? He stopped in his doorway, turned. You noticed the creek. The first day, coming in on the road. She held his look without apology. Something's wrong with the flow. It's too low for the season. He was quiet for just a moment, the same quality of quiet he'd had in the wagon, that measuring thing. And then he said, yeah, just that. 6 in the morning. He left. Eleanor sat alone in the kitchen for a while, listening to the house settle around her, the timber contracting in the cooling night air. She put her hand on the table and felt the grain of the wood under her palm. She had made it this far. She had gotten inside. She had begun. The hard part, and she knew this with the practical, unsentimental clarity that 11 months of planning had given her, the hard part was still ahead. Victor Crow was still out there, moving, building, destroying. He had already taken the water. He would take more. He didn't know she was here yet. That was the only advantage she had, and she intended to use every hour of it. She stood up, banked the lamp, and went to bed. She lay in the dark in the narrow room with her bag on the floor beside her, one hand resting on the leather, in the habit she'd developed on the road, the way you keep a hand near something precious when you're sleeping somewhere unfamiliar. Outside, the Wyoming night was enormous and cold and completely indifferent to anyone's plans. Eleanor Voss, who had been Eleanor Crow once, who had a different name for herself in the private accounting she carried in her chest, closed her eyes. She had work to do in the morning. The 6th morning arrived the way Wyoming mornings arrived that time of year, without warning or apology, a hard white light that came over the eastern ridge and turned everything it touched into something both beautiful and brutally clear. Eleanor was already in the kitchen when it arrived. She'd been up for an hour. She heard Silas before she saw him. He came through the bunkhouse door with the deliberate early morning loudness of a man who wanted to be heard, making his presence known to the two hands already eating their breakfast with the ease of authority. So long held, it had become invisible to him. He poured his coffee. He said something that made one of the younger hands laugh. He was, Eleanor understood, performing, but the performance was so natural to him it probably didn't feel like one. She came through the back door with a tray of bread she'd pulled from the oven. The talking stopped. Not dramatically, not the way talking stops in stories, just the small, involuntary pause that happens when something unexpected enters a room. When the expected rhythm of a morning gets interrupted by something that doesn't fit the story everyone has agreed to be telling. She set the bread on the table. She went back to the kitchen for the butter and the preserves she'd put up herself using the correct jars from the shelf. She came back and set those down too. Eat, she said, because apparently someone needed to say it. One of the younger hands, a boy of maybe 19, dark-haired, with the particular expression of someone who hasn't yet decided what kind of person he wants to be, reached for a piece of bread with the reflex of someone responding to food before he'd had a chance to wonder if it was the right political move. He bit into it. His eyebrows rose. "That's good," he said, before he could help himself. Silas hadn't moved. He was looking at Eleanor from across the room with the steady attention of a man who has realized a situation is more complicated than he originally assessed it and is deciding what to do about that. Eleanor looked back at him with equal steadiness and then went back to the kitchen, because she had work to do and didn't require his approval to do it. She rode out to the Eastern Creek line with Caleb at 6:30. The morning was cold and neither of them spoke much for the first mile, which suited Eleanor fine. She was watching the land, the way the grass changed on the eastern side, drier, sparser, the ground harder than it should be. Animals adapt to water loss with a speed that humans don't always notice. The cattle in the east pasture had already begun the slow drift westward, following instinct, finding the lesser damp closer to the main house. They wouldn't complain until there was nothing left to find. "How long has the flow been reduced?" she asked. 7 weeks. Caleb's voice was controlled. "Maybe 8. And the easement agreement?" He shifted in the saddle in the way people shift when a question touches something that still hurts. "My father negotiated it with the original Crow family 40 years ago, rights to draw from the upper channel in exchange for maintaining the eastern fence line." He paused. "Victor bought out the property 3 years ago, inherited the agreement. But he says you're behind on payments." "There are no payments. It was a maintenance agreement, not a financial one." Caleb's jaw was tight. He's inventing the default because he knows the original contract documents are complicated. Eleanor looked at him. "Complicated how?" "The original was filed with the Territorial Land Office, which burned down in 1879. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. "Is there a copy?" Eleanor asked carefully. "My father kept his copy in the house. When he died, He stopped. The controlled voice slipped for just a moment. One word unfinished, one breath too visible. Then it came back. "I couldn't find it. I don't know if I didn't look in the right places or if it was taken." Eleanor was very still on her horse. She was thinking about a particular set of documents she'd seen once, years ago, in an office in Chicago that had since been cleaned out and rented to someone else. She was thinking about her half-brother's habit of keeping very careful records of every transaction he'd ever been involved in, including, she knew, every legal document he'd ever acquired or arranged to disappear. "Victor Crow has the copy," she said. Caleb turned to look at her. "How would you—" "It's what someone like him does." She kept her voice neutral. "Men who build power the way he does. They don't destroy documents. They collect them, control them. The contract that proves your right to the water is probably sitting in a file cabinet in his house right now." Caleb stared at her. The creek bed was visible from where they'd stopped, a thinned, sluggish current running through cracked mud that had been properly submerged a season ago. The evidence was right there in the earth. "You sound like you know him," Caleb said slowly. "I know the type," Eleanor said, and that too was true. She turned her horse back toward the ranch. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, but her face was doing what it had always done in complicated situations, which was nothing much at all. "We need to talk about the ledger discrepancies," she said. "Tonight, after supper." She rode back ahead of him, leaving him to look at his drying creek and reach whatever conclusions a man reaches when a woman he ordered from a catalog turns out to see his problems more clearly than he does himself. Yeah, that night she opened her bag. She did it carefully, the way she always did it, in the dark, with the lamp turned low, sitting on the floor beside the bed, rather than on it, so she could hear the door better. She lifted out the clothes on top, the small sewing kit, the copy of the Farmer's Almanac she'd bought in Cheyenne. She reached to the bottom, past the false seam she'd sewn with her own hands in a boarding house in St. Louis, and felt the paper-wrapped bundle. She laid it on the bed in the low light and sat looking at it for a while without opening it. 11 months. That was how long she'd been doing this. Since the morning she'd arrived at the empty Chicago office that used to be Crow Holdings and found the 2 clerks trying to destroy a file cabinet's worth of records, and had stopped them. Not through any particular heroism, just by being there and understanding what she was looking at faster than they expected someone to understand it. She'd taken what she could carry. She'd left before anyone thought to ask her why she was there. Victor hadn't known about her. That was the fundamental truth that made everything else possible. She was Eleanor Voss, not Eleanor Crow. Her mother's name, the name she'd taken when she left their father's house at 17 and never gone back. Victor was 12 years older. He barely remembered she existed. She'd spent 11 months verifying that she had enough, that what she'd taken from the office was sufficient, that there were other documents, filed copies, bank records, property deeds with forged signatures, that could be obtained through the right channels. Caleb Whitmore's advertisement had come to her through a cousin in Cheyenne who'd mentioned the ranch offhanded, mentioned Victor Crow's name in connection with it, mentioned the water dispute, mentioned a man being slowly ruined by someone working in the shadows. She hadn't planned to marry anyone. She'd planned to come west, find the right moment, and find the right legal authority. What she hadn't anticipated was how long that moment might take to arrive, or how dangerous the waiting would be, or how thoroughly Victor had already embedded himself in the local power structure. She needed cover. She needed time. She needed to be somewhere that wasn't a hotel room or a boarding house where Victor's name could come up and connect her to something. She had needed Black Ridge Ranch. She had needed Caleb Whitmore, though not in the way the contract suggested. The fact that he turned out to be a real person, flawed, holding his grief quietly, smarter than he wanted people to know, that wasn't something she'd factored in. That was something she was still working out what to do with. She wrapped the papers back up. She replaced everything above the false seam. She set the bag beside the bed. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed against the window glass, and somewhere out in the dark, on the land his father's father had grazed cattle on, Victor Crow was drawing maps and making plans, and absolutely certain he was winning. Eleanor turned off the lamp. He had no idea she was here. He had no idea what she was carrying. She intended to keep it that way for exactly as long as she needed to, and not 1 hour longer. The bread was gone by 7 in the morning. Eleanor noticed it the way she noticed most things, not by looking for it specifically, but by registering an absence where something had been. She'd set 3 loaves out before the ranch hands came through for their morning meal, and when she came back through the bunkhouse dining room to collect the dishes, the board was clean. Not a heel left, not a crumb worth mentioning. She stood there for a moment with the empty tray and thought about what that meant. Food is not a small thing when people are struggling. She'd learned that in the Chicago factory at 16, eating her lunch in 12 minutes because that was all the time they gave you, and you needed every calorie you could get to finish the afternoon shift. She'd learned it again in the boarding houses, where the quality of the evening meal told you everything about the financial health of the establishment within 48 hours of arrival. People who are hungry eat fast, and they eat everything, and they don't talk much while they're doing it. People who are fed, really fed, not just calorie managed, sit a few minutes longer. They look around. They say something to the person next to them. 3 of the hands had sat a few minutes longer this morning. She'd seen it through the kitchen doorway without making it obvious she was watching. Silas had not. She took that information and stored it where she stored everything useful, quietly, without conclusion, waiting to see what it connected to. The ledger work from the night before had left Caleb with a restlessness she could see in him at breakfast. He ate quickly and left the table without his second cup of coffee, which Mrs. Hatch noted with the precise disapproval of a woman who has kept track of a man's habits long enough to know when they've changed. Eleanor said nothing about it. She cleared the table and went back to the kitchen and started on the inventory list she'd been building since her second day. The kitchen itself was beginning to cooperate. That was the only way she could think of it. Not that she'd fixed it, but that it had stopped fighting her. The pantry smelled of dried herbs now instead of the previous combination of mouse evidence and old grease. The stove drew better since she'd cleared the flue. Mrs. Hatch moved around her with the stiff courtesy of a temporary ceasefire, and Eleanor accepted that as the working arrangement it was. She was deep into the supply list when she heard the argument start. It came from the direction of the barn. Not words yet, just the tone, that particular escalation of male voices that happens when something routine has stopped being routine. She set down her pencil. She listened for a moment, trying to read the situation from sound alone. And then she heard Caleb's voice cut through, not loud but carrying, the voice of a man who does not raise it often and therefore gets heard when he does. She went to the back door and looked out. In the yard between the house and the barn, Caleb was standing with 3 men. 2 of them she recognized, Hadley and the young, dark-haired boy whose name she'd learned was Pete. The third was a man she hadn't seen before, thick-set and trail-dirty, with the particular stance of someone who has arrived with news they know is going to be unwelcome. Silas was standing slightly apart from the group, arms crossed, watching with his usual careful neutrality that was not neutral at all. She didn't go out. Not yet. She watched. The thick-set man was talking. Caleb listened, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the moment when whatever was being said crossed from inconvenient to genuinely serious. A subtle change, the kind you only caught if you were watching for it. His head went down briefly, came back up. He looked toward the house. He found her at the back door immediately, which meant he'd looked for her specifically, which told her something about where she'd been placed in his internal accounting of people to consult when something went wrong. She walked out. The thick-set man's name was Roy Fenner, and he ran a small cattle operation 6 miles east of Black Ridge, which put him squarely in the same water situation Caleb was facing. He'd ridden over that morning because he'd been to Millard Creek 2 days ago and found something he thought Caleb needed to see. Victor's men are building a diversion dam, Roy said. He had the flat, statement-of-fact delivery of someone who's had 2 days to absorb shocking information and has come out the other side into a grim kind of calm. Up near the top of the eastern channel, before it splits to your property and mine. They started it last week. By the time the fall rains come, if they come, that water is going to go exactly where Victor wants it to go, and nowhere else. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Is it on his land? Eleanor asked. Roy looked at her with the brief, recalibrating look men gave her when they hadn't expected her to speak. The upper channel, the part above the split, runs through a section that's been disputed since the original territory surveys. Nobody filed a clear claim on it because nobody thought it mattered. It was just water flowing where it had always flowed. Until someone decided it mattered, Eleanor said. Until Victor decided it mattered. Roy shifted his weight. I talked to 2 other ranchers on the way here, the Hendersons and Old Man Pruitt. They're in the same position. Between the 4 of us, we've got maybe 6 weeks of water supply at current flow before we've got cattle in serious trouble. Caleb turned and walked away from the group by about 10 feet. He stood there with his back to them, looking at the eastern ridge, doing the math that Eleanor suspected he'd been doing since Victor Crow's visit 3 days before she arrived, and was only now, with an audience, being forced to say out loud. We could file an injunction, Eleanor said to Roy. Quietly, not trying to carry it to Caleb. Water rights disputes go through the territorial court in Cheyenne. If there's documentation of the original flow agreement, half the papers in this county burned with the land office, Roy said. He wasn't being dismissive, just accurate. Victor's lawyers know that. It's why he chose now to move. He's been waiting for the right moment. Eleanor nodded. She knew that too. She knew it in a very specific way. Caleb turned back around. What do you need from me, Roy? I need to know if you're in. If the 4 of us go to the county seat together, we've got more standing than any one of us alone. He paused. And I need to know if you've got any documentation. Anything. Because I've got nothing, and the Hendersons are in the same boat, and without something in writing, we're just 4 ranchers complaining about a man who has lawyers. Caleb looked at Eleanor. She met his look and said nothing, because this wasn't the moment, and she needed him to know she understood that without her having to say it. Give me 2 days, Caleb said to Roy. Come back Thursday. We'll have an answer. Roy nodded, climbed back on his horse, and rode out. The hands drifted back toward their work. Silas went last, and he went slowly. And he looked at Eleanor once as he passed. Not a hostile look, something more complicated than that. Something she filed away without trying to name it yet. Caleb waited until they were alone in the yard before he said, You know something. I know a lot of things, Eleanor said. Some of them are useful to you. Some of them aren't ready yet. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning sun had moved up and the yard was full of it now. No shadows to stand in, everything too bright and clear. I need you to tell me what you know. I will, she said. When I can tell you all of it. Right now I can tell you part of it, and part of it is going to raise questions I can't answer yet. And if you go to the county seat with questions you can't answer, Victor's lawyers will use that against you. She held his gaze. Trust me for 2 more days. Please. That word, please, was not one she used easily. He heard that. He turned and went back inside. Eleanor stood in the yard alone for a moment, looking east, toward the ridge she couldn't see past, toward the land where Victor Crow's men were stacking stone across a waterway that had been flowing the same direction for 40 years. She went back to the kitchen and picked up her pencil. The night that changed the household dynamic. The one that Caleb would remember later as the night he understood what he'd actually married, started because of a drunk man and a pot of beans. Wade Cutler had been the cook for the ranch hands since before Roy Fenner's visit, a position he'd held with minimal distinction for 3 years on the strength of being willing to do it when no one else was. He was not a bad man. He was a man who drank too much and had organized his entire life around making that fact as invisible as possible, which required a significant amount of ongoing creative energy that left little room for improving his cooking. On Wednesday evening, Eleanor came through the bunkhouse to return a lamp she'd borrowed for the pantry work, and found Wade passed out at the cooking table with a pot of salt pork beans burning slowly on the stove, and 6 men waiting on their dinner with the resigned patience of people who had learned not to expect much. Pete, the dark-haired boy, was trying to manage the pot with the expression of someone handling a situation well outside his training. Eleanor took the pot off the heat. She looked at Wade. She looked at the pantry. She looked at the 6 men. "Give me 40 minutes," she said. Nobody told her not to. She went back to the main house kitchen and returned with what she'd need, working fast because 40 minutes was optimistic and she knew it. She had dried venison she'd been soaking for a stew she'd planned for tomorrow. She had the remainder of the bread from morning. She had the preserved tomatoes she'd been rationing because the seal on those jars had held. And those were good tomatoes, better than anything the ranch had put up in years. She had dried beans that hadn't been burned to the bottom of a pot and could be salvaged with hot water and some basic competence. She cooked the way she did everything else, without performance, without commentary, just the movement of someone who knows what they're doing and is doing it. The bunkhouse kitchen was cramped and badly organized and smelled of Wade's history with it, but the stove was sound and the basics were there if you knew how to find them. 35 minutes later, she put food on the table. It wasn't elaborate. It was beans with the venison cut through them, the tomatoes broken in for acid and sweetness, bread to eat alongside it, a pot of coffee that was actually coffee and not the brown water the ranch had been subsisting on. But it was hot, and it was seasoned, and it was made by someone who gave a damn whether it tasted like something. The men sat down and ate, and nobody said anything for a while. Then Hap Tillis, who was in his 50s and had been doing ranch work for 30 years, and had developed the economy of speech that comes from living in places where words cost something, said, without looking up from his bowl, "This is the best thing I've eaten since March." Nobody argued with him. Pete ate 2 servings without appearing to notice he'd done it. The 2 men who'd been most consistently in Silas's orbit, a pair named Garrett and Dutch, ate without comment, but ate everything. Eleanor collected the dishes afterward and didn't make anything of it, because making something of it would have ruined it. She was washing up in the bunkhouse kitchen when Silas came in. He came alone, which was deliberate. He moved to the other side of the work table and stood there, and she kept washing dishes and let him decide what he'd come in to say. "You don't have to feed the hands," he said. "That's not your job." "Someone needed to," Eleanor said. "Wade's not able to tonight." "Wade's been like that before. They manage." She set a bowl in the drying rack and picked up the next one. "They don't have to manage if they don't have to." Silas was quiet for a moment. He was working something out. She could feel it in the quality of his silence, that it was active rather than passive. Finally he said, "What are you actually doing here?" Eleanor looked up from the washing for the first time. She looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at him in the yard, without aggression and without retreat. "The same thing you are," she said, "trying to keep this ranch from falling apart." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Caleb trust you?" "You'd have to ask him." "I'm asking you." "He's starting to," Eleanor said, "the same way you're starting to, and don't bother denying it because you came in here alone and you're asking me something real." Silas's jaw moved. He wasn't quite smiling, but the hostility had changed shape into something that might eventually become something else. "You got nerve," he said finally. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It wasn't an insult either. "I've had to," Eleanor said, and went back to washing dishes. He left without another word. But he left differently than he'd come in, and she felt that difference in the quality of the air in the bunkhouse kitchen after he was gone. She told Caleb about Wade that night, in the office where he'd retreated after dinner with the ledger and the particular focused misery of a man trying to find a solution in numbers that aren't cooperating. She told it plainly. Wade was not reliable, the hands needed consistent food, the bunkhouse kitchen was manageable if someone took it seriously. "Mrs. Hatch can't run both," Eleanor said, "and Wade isn't going to stop drinking." Caleb set down his pencil. "What are you suggesting?" "I'll run the bunkhouse kitchen until you can find someone. I can manage both for now. The main house meals are simple enough and the timing doesn't conflict." She paused. "And it gives me a reason to be in the bunkhouse regularly without anyone finding it strange." Caleb looked at her with the steady attention she'd come to recognize as his version of interest. "Why do you need a reason to be in the bunkhouse?" "Because there are things I need to know about what the men are saying and hearing, and people talk more honestly in a kitchen than anywhere else, especially if the food is good. She kept her voice matter of fact. Victor Crow has someone feeding him information about this ranch. The pattern of what he's done and when he's done it suggests he knows things he shouldn't know. Someone on this property is talking. The silence in the office was different from any silence they'd had before. She watched Caleb absorb it, watched the thing it cost him, the specific cost of believing that a betrayal might be coming from inside his own crew, from people he'd known for years. "You're sure?" he said. "Not yet, but I'm looking." She held his gaze. "Will you let me?" He looked at the ledger. He looked at the window, which gave him nothing back but dark glass. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Yes, do it." She nodded and stood up. She was almost to the door when he said her name. Not Miss Voss, just Eleanor for the first time. She stopped. "The papers you mentioned," he said. "When Victor came here last week, before you arrived, he said something about documentation, about having proof that my father defaulted on the original agreement." He paused carefully. "How would he have proof of something that didn't happen?" Eleanor kept her hand on the doorframe. Her voice came out level. "Because he made it," she said. "That's what men like Victor do. They don't just destroy the evidence that hurts them. They manufacture evidence that helps them." She let that settle. "Which means somewhere, sir, in a courthouse, in a filing office, in his own records, there's a document that claims your father defaulted. And if we can show it's fabricated, it's not just his water claim that falls apart." Caleb was very still. "Everything falls apart. Everything he's built on that foundation." She turned slightly. "2 more days, Caleb. Let me have 2 more days." He nodded. His face was the face of a man making a decision he's not entirely sure of but has run out of better options. That was fine. She was used to that. She went to her room. She lit the lamp on its lowest setting and sat on the floor beside her bag and thought carefully about the timeline. 2 days. She had 2 days before Roy Fenner came back, before the meeting with the other ranchers, before Caleb would need to go to the county seat with something or go with nothing. She needed to know what documents Caleb had in the house. She needed to know what Victor's men had found, if anything, in the months they'd presumably been watching this property. She needed to know who on this ranch was talking and what they'd said. And she needed to do all of that without Victor learning she existed. She reached into the bag. She took out the papers from below the false seam and laid them on the floor. She went through them for what felt like the 1,000th time, reading each one in the low light with the careful attention of someone checking not just for what was there, but for what might be used, what might be enough, what a territorial judge would look at and understand. It was enough. She believed it was enough. She had believed that in Chicago, had believed it in every boarding house since, but belief was not the same as certainty, and she'd learned not to confuse them. She wrapped the papers back up. She sat for a while in the dark with her back against the bed frame and her hands in her lap. In the morning, she would find out what Caleb had in the house. In the morning, she would begin the careful work of learning which man was reporting back to Victor. In the morning, the situation would move forward, and she would move with it, and everything that had been static for 11 months would begin to accelerate. She was ready for that. She had made herself ready for it. What she hadn't made herself ready for was the way Caleb had said her name, just that, Eleanor, like it was something he'd been given and had decided to hold carefully. She noticed that the way she noticed the bread disappearing from the tray and the change in Silas's silence, as information, as something that would connect to other things eventually, as something that needed to be stored where she could think about it honestly. She turned off the lamp and lay down on the narrow bed and listened to the ranch sleep around her. Outside, the creek ran at its thin, diminished level through the eastern channel, carrying what was left of what Black Ridge Ranch needed to survive. Somewhere up that waterway, in the dark, Victor Crow's men were stacking stones. Eleanor closed her eyes. The morning would come without asking her permission. It always did. Thursday arrived the way Caleb had been dreading it, clear-skied and ordinary, the kind of day that has no interest in the weight of the things people carry through it. Roy Fenner came at 9. He came with Henderson, a lean, weathered man of 60, who shook hands with the economy of someone who'd done a lot of significant handshaking and had stopped putting feeling into the gesture. Pruitt didn't come himself, but sent his oldest son, who was 24 and serious, and had clearly been given specific instructions about what to say and how to say it. They met in the front room of the main house, which was the only room large enough for 5 people to sit without crowding. Mrs. Hatch brought coffee and then removed herself from the situation with the tact of a woman who has learned which conversations to witness and which to leave alone. Eleanor sat in the chair nearest the window, which was not the most prominent position in the room and was exactly the position she wanted. Caleb sat at the table. Roy and Henderson sat across from him. Young Pruitt took the chair near the door like a man keeping his options available. Roy spread a hand-drawn map on the table. This is the upper channel from where it comes off the ridge to where it splits. Victor's Dam is here. He put his finger on a point about 2/3 up. On current progress, I'd estimate they've got it operable in 10 days, maybe 12. Henderson said, 10 days and I've got cattle I can't water. Same, Roy said. Caleb looked at the map. What's our standing for an injunction? Slim, Roy said. Without documentation of the original flow agreements, we're asking a judge to halt construction on land. Victor has a facially valid claim to, based on nothing but our assertion that the water was always ours. He rubbed the back of his neck. Victor has a lawyer in Cheyenne, has had one for 2 years. Man named Aldridge. He's good. Aldridge I know, Caleb said. Then you know we can't walk into that courthouse and lose. We only get one real try at this before Victor's construction is complete and the legal landscape changes. The room was quiet. Eleanor looked at the map. She looked at the point Roy's finger had marked. There's a county surveyor's record, she said. Everyone looked at her. The Territorial Land Office burned, she continued, keeping her voice careful and precise. But the county surveyor's records are separate. They're kept in the county clerk's office, not the land office. Every survey done in this region since 1861 has a corresponding entry. She paused. The original water channel survey for this area was done in 1863. It would show the natural course of the eastern channel and every claimed easement filed against it at that time. Roy looked at Caleb. Caleb was looking at Eleanor. How do you know that? Roy asked. Because I checked, she said simply. Before I came here. I spent 2 days in Cheyenne looking into the land records for this region. She let that sit there. The survey record won't give you the private agreement between your father and the original Crows, but it will establish the natural course of the water and the fact that your property's eastern boundary was surveyed with the assumption of that water access. That's not nothing. That's a foundation. Henderson leaned forward. Could Aldridge argue around it? He could try, but it shifts the burden. Right now, Victor is claiming a right to restrict water he never previously restricted. With the survey record, you're the ones with historical standing, and he's the one making an extraordinary claim. She folded her hands in her lap. And if there's any documentation in this house, any letter, any entry in an old account book, anything that references the water arrangement even obliquely, we need to find it before you go to that courthouse. Young Pruitt said, from his chair near the door, My father has letters. From the late 60s. He wrote to the original Crow family about the spring maintenance. They're in a box in his house. Everyone looked at him. He looked slightly startled at the attention, like he'd forgotten for a moment that speaking in this room carried weight. Those letters, Eleanor said, and she kept her voice completely level even as something moved in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to relief. Would they reference the water agreement? They reference everything, young Pruitt said. My father kept every piece of paper he ever received. Always said paper was the one thing that didn't lie. Roy let out a breath. Combined with the survey record, it's not a guarantee, Eleanor said, because she needed them to be clear on that. It's leverage. It's enough leverage to make Aldridge's position complicated, and complicated enough that Victor may decide the cost of continuing isn't worth what he gains. She looked at Caleb. But the survey record needs to be requested formally and quickly. It needs to be in a lawyer's hands before Victor's people realize we're looking. Caleb said, Can you ride to the county seat? I can ride wherever I need to ride, Eleanor said. Henderson looked at Roy. Roy looked at Caleb. The Pruitt boy was still sitting up straight near the door, looking like a young man who has just understood that the meeting he was sent to observe turned into something more important than expected. All right, Roy said, we do it. Caleb looked at Eleanor across the table with the particular expression she'd been accumulating, adding each one to a private collection she hadn't meant to start. It was the look of a man recalibrating, steadily and with some effort, the picture he'd formed of his own situation. 2 days you said you needed, he said quietly. You used them. I used them, she said. Outside the window, the sky was the flat, clean blue of a Wyoming morning that doesn't know or care what the people under it are worried about. Somewhere to the east, stones were stacking in the water. Somewhere in a box in an old man's house, letters were waiting in the dark to become evidence. Eleanor Voss looked at the map on the table and thought about everything she was not yet saying and everything that was coming regardless, and the precise, fragile moment she was standing in, where things could still go either way. She thought, not yet, hold, not yet. She reached out and touched the edge of the map with 2 fingers, orienting herself to the land she was learning, the water that was being stolen, the man across the table who was starting, slowly, carefully, the way a wary man does it, to trust her. We should leave by first light tomorrow, she said. The sooner we get to the clerk's office, the sooner we know what we have. Nobody argued with that. They left at first light, which in Wyoming in late August meant leaving in a darkness that was just beginning to consider becoming something else. A faint graying at the eastern edge. Not light yet, just the absence of full dark. Caleb drove. Eleanor sat beside him on the wagon bench with her coat pulled close and her bag between her feet, and they didn't talk much for the first hour, which suited the road and the hour and both of them. The county seat was Harwick, 22 miles northwest, and the road was good for the first half and unreliable after the creek crossing at mile 14. They needed to be at the clerk's office when it opened at 8. The land moved past them in the early quiet. Eleanor watched it the same way she'd watched everything since arriving, registering, filing, building a map of this place in her mind the way she built maps of every place she stayed long enough to matter. She noticed where the grass was still green against the slopes. She noticed the cattle on the Henderson property as they passed. Thin, she thought, thinner than they should be this time of year, already showing the early signs of a water shortage that had been going on longer than 10 days. How long has Victor actually been at this? She asked. Not the diversion dam, the larger thing. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. 3 years since he bought the Crow property from the estate. First year, nothing much. He was setting up, hiring men, learning the region. A pause. Second year, he started what I thought were minor disputes, boundary questions, grazing rights, nothing that seemed connected. Another pause. This year, it all became connected. He was mapping, Eleanor said. Caleb looked at her. He spent the first year learning what everyone had and what everyone needed. The second year testing which disputes people would fight and which they'd let go. She looked at the road ahead. This year he's moving because he knows exactly what he's doing and exactly how much resistance he's going to get. The wagon went over a rut and settled. Caleb was quiet for a while. You talk about him like you've studied him. I have, Eleanor said. He didn't push further than that. She was grateful for it and made a note of the gratitude. Another thing to add to the private accounting she was keeping of Caleb Whitmore, the ledger of small things that told her what kind of man she was actually dealing with. The county clerk's office in Harwick smelled of old paper and lamp oil and the specific staleness of a room that keeps its windows closed to protect documents from humidity. The clerk, a man named Hobart, with an impressive set of side whiskers and the careful movements of someone who takes the responsibility of paper very seriously, looked up from his desk when they came in and appeared to be deciding, from the look of them, what category of business this was going to be. Survey records, Eleanor said. Eastern Channel surveys, this county, filed between 1860 and 1870. Hobart's eyes moved from her to Caleb and back. Those records are public record, he said, in the tone of a man clarifying something he expected to be challenged on. I know, Eleanor said. That's why we're here. He brought out 2 bound survey books, large and heavy, and smelling of their age, and set them on the reading table. Eleanor opened the first one and began. Caleb sat across from her and watched her work. And what he watched was someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and knew how to find it in a document meant to be difficult. Cross-referencing index entries, checking the notation system, moving backward from reference numbers to original survey entries with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this kind of archival work before. Where did you learn to read survey documents? He asked, not accusatory, just genuinely curious. Chicago, she said without looking up. I worked for a land attorney's office for 2 years, filing mostly and indexing, but you learn a lot about documents when you spend all day with them. That was true. It left out why she'd sought that particular job, what she'd been looking for in those files, what she'd found, and what she hadn't. She turned a page, and there it was. Survey Entry 1863, October, Eastern Watershed Survey, Red Canyon Region. Natural course of the waterway designated CR7 established as originating at the ridge formation, known locally as Blacktop, and proceeding south-southeast through parcels designated. She read the parcel numbers carefully, cross-referencing against the index, through parcels that were now Black Ridge Ranch, the Henderson property, the Pruitt land, and 3 smaller holdings. The survey noted, in the careful bureaucratic language of the era, that all downstream parcels had been surveyed under the assumption of continued natural water flow, and that any modification of the natural course would constitute a material change requiring resurvey and refiling with the county clerk. "Here," she said. Caleb leaned over. She turned the book toward him and pointed to the relevant passage, keeping her finger under the line so he could follow. He read it. Read it again. That's what we need. Part of what we need. She was already moving to the second book. There should be a corresponding parcel registration that lists every claimed easement against that waterway at the time of original filing. If the Crow family registered an easement then, the original family, before Victor, it should show the terms they claimed. She found it 7 pages in. The original Crow easement registration, dated 1864, claiming the right to draw irrigation water from the upper section of CR7 in exchange for maintaining the eastern boundary fence of what was now called the Crow property. The terms were specific, and the terms did not include any right to modify or redirect the natural course. The right was to draw from it, not to dam it, not to reroute it. Eleanor sat back in her chair. Something released in her chest. Not dramatically, just a small loosening of something that had been held tight for a very long time. "The easement Victor inherited," she said carefully, "gives him the right to draw water from the upper channel. It does not give him the right to divert it. The dam isn't just a water rights dispute. It's a violation of the recorded easement that his own property is held under." Caleb stared at the page. He put his hand flat on the book the way a man touches something he's afraid might not be real. "Can Hobart make us certified copies?" Eleanor asked. Yes. Caleb looked up. "He charges for it." "Then we pay for it." She closed the second book and went to the clerk's desk, and while Hobart was processing the copy request with the deliberate pace of a man who understood the importance of his role in the legal order, Eleanor stood at the counter and thought about what came next. The survey records were the foundation. The Pruitt letters would build on it. Combined, they gave a territorial judge enough to issue a temporary injunction halting construction pending a full hearing. That would buy time. Time was what they needed. What they needed beyond that, what would end this rather than just pause it, was something else. Something Eleanor had been carrying for 11 months in the bottom of a bag. She looked at the certified copies Hobart was preparing with his careful, unhurried hand. Soon, she thought. Not yet, but soon. They were an hour outside of Harwick on the return road when the other wagon appeared. It came from a side track that joined the main road from the east, and it was moving fast for a wagon, faster than the road comfortably permitted. And when it pulled onto the main road ahead of them and slowed, Eleanor saw the man on the bench clearly. He was not Victor. He was one of Victor's men. She recognized the type, if not the specific face, the particular look of someone employed for utility rather than character, a man paid to be present and to report back. He looked at their wagon. He looked at Eleanor. His gaze moved to the satchel Caleb had tucked under the bench, which was where the certified copies were sitting. He kept going. He didn't stop. Eleanor kept her face forward and her hands still. In her lap, out of sight, her fingers had gone cold. "That man works for Victor," she said. Her voice was even. Caleb glanced back over his shoulder. The other wagon was already receding behind them. "You recognize him?" "I recognize what he was doing." She turned to look at Caleb. "He was on that side road when we came through. He saw us coming from the county seat direction, and he looked at your bag." Caleb's jaw tightened. "You think he was watching the road?" "I think someone knew we were going to Harwick and set a watch on the road from the county seat." She paused. "Which means the informant on your ranch is still active. The meeting yesterday morning with Roy and the others. Someone reported it." The wagon moved through the silence of the open road, and both of them sat with what that meant. Eleanor was running the meeting backward in her mind, accounting for everyone present, everyone in the house who could have overheard. Mrs. Hatch, who had brought coffee and left. The hands who were working within earshot of the front room windows. Silas, who she'd thought was at the barn but hadn't actually confirmed. "I need you to trust me to handle this my way," she said. "What's your way?" "I'm going to tell the person who's reporting to Victor something specific, something false, and we're going to see what Victor does with it." She looked at Caleb steadily. "Which means I need to know exactly who was in a position to hear yesterday's meeting." He thought about it. She could see him thinking, the same kind of careful inventory she was running, going through his household and his crew with the uncomfortable precision of a man looking for something he doesn't want to find. "Silas was near the east window," he said finally. "I don't know if he could have heard from there." Eleanor said nothing to that. "You think it's Silas?" Caleb said. His voice was flat. Not a question. "I don't know yet." That was honest. "But his connection to the Crow name is something I've been thinking about since you first told me his name." She paused. "Silas Crow. Is he related to Victor?" The silence that followed was different from any they'd had. It had a texture to it, the texture of something Caleb had either not thought about, or had thought about and put away, and was now being asked to pick back up. "Distant," Caleb said slowly. "Victor's family and Silas's family. There was some relation on the original Crow side. Cousins maybe, once or twice removed. He's been here long enough, I never connected it to Victor." He stopped. "My father hired him." "Your father hired him when the original Crows were neighbors, not enemies," Eleanor said. "It may not mean anything. Or it may mean that Victor has had someone inside this ranch since before he even bought the property." Caleb's hands on the reins tightened until the leather creased. Eleanor watched it happen and didn't look away because she thought he deserved to have someone witness this. The moment a man realizes the betrayal he feared might be real. "Don't confront him," she said. "Not yet. We use it." He nodded. One movement, controlled. He was holding it together with the specific effort of a man who has been holding things together alone for a long time and has had just enough practice to do it in public. They didn't speak again for the rest of the ride. Eleanor went through the house that evening. She waited until Caleb was in the barn with Hap and Pete doing the evening work, until Mrs. Hatch had retired to her room with her headache that appeared reliably at the end of difficult days, until the house was as empty as it got. Then she went through it room by room, not looking for anything in particular and therefore looking for everything. She wasn't searching for what had been taken. She was building a map of what Caleb had and didn't know he had. His father's study was at the back of the house, a room that had been closed and not much used since the old man died, and which smelled of that closure, dust and old pipe tobacco, and the particular stillness of a room that hasn't been breathed in for years. She lit a lamp and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking. The desk had 3 drawers. The shelves had books and account books and a collection of rolled maps that she went through first, carefully, unrolling each one on the desk and examining it in the lamplight before rolling it back. Most were property surveys, the kind a rancher accumulated over decades of boundary negotiations and water disputes. 2 of them she set aside. One showed the original parcel boundaries when Caleb's father had first filed the land claim. The other showed the CR7 watershed with handwritten notations in a careful, old-fashioned script she didn't recognize. The desk drawers gave her correspondence, lots of it, tied in bundles by year, the organizational system of a man who'd understood that paper was evidence and had treated it accordingly. She went through the most recent bundles first, working backward, and it was in 1878, 7 years before the present, that she found it. A letter from Martin Crow, the original family. Victor's father. She read it standing at the desk with the lamp turned up, and what she read made her stand very still for a long moment. The letter was about the water easement. It was written in the context of a dispute that had apparently arisen between the 2 families over fence maintenance. Martin Crow asserting that Caleb's father had not maintained the eastern fence to the standard the original agreement required. The letter was not hostile, just firm, and Caleb's father had apparently responded because Martin Crow's letter referenced a previous response. But the substance of what mattered was this. Martin Crow's letter confirmed, in writing, the existence and the terms of the original water agreement. He described it specifically. the right to draw water from the upper CR7 channel in exchange for fence maintenance. And he described it as an agreement made in good faith that both families had honored for 15 years. It was not the original contract, but it was a letter from the Crow family themselves describing the contract. It was Victor's own father's handwriting confirming the arrangement that Victor was now claiming had never been properly established. Eleanor set the letter down on the desk beside the maps she'd already pulled. She breathed carefully. She went back to the drawers. She worked through 2 more years and found 3 more letters from Martin Crow on various topics. None as directly relevant, but all establishing a long documented relationship between the 2 families that contradicted Victor's current claim that the water arrangement had been informal and unenforceable. She also found, in the back of the bottom drawer behind a broken pen nib and a receipts envelope from 1872, a folded document that she almost missed because it had worked its way against the back panel of the drawer and stuck there with the passage of years. She worked it free carefully, unfolded it. It was a handwritten copy of the original agreement. Not the territorial filing, that was the document that had been in the land office when it burned. But this was a copy, made by hand, signed by both Caleb's father and Martin Crow, and witnessed by 2 names she didn't recognize but could potentially trace. Her hands were not shaking. She was proud of that. She set the document down very gently, the way you set down something that might break if handled wrong, even though paper doesn't break that way, and she knew it. She stood in the dead man's study in the lamplight and looked at what was on the desk. Survey records from the county seat, certified copies in the satchel in the front room. Letters from Martin Crow confirming the water arrangement in his own words. A handwritten copy of the original agreement signed by both parties. And in her bag, in the bottom below the false seam, documents from a Chicago office that connected Victor Crow to a pattern of property fraud stretching back 12 years across 4 territories. She thought, it's enough. The legal case for the water injunction was strong. The larger case, the one that would end Victor's empire rather than just stall his dam, was, with what she was holding, very probably sufficient. She began carefully replacing everything in the drawers in the exact order she'd found it, except for the letter from 1878 and the handwritten copy, which she took with her. Caleb needed to see these. He needed to understand what his father had left him without knowing he'd left it. She was at the study door when she heard the floorboard. It was a sound she recognized from boarding houses, the specific creak of someone who knows where the boards sound and is stepping around them, which means they know this house well enough to have practiced that navigation. It came from the direction of the back hallway. She turned the lamp down. Not all the way. Just enough to change the quality of the light from occupied to dim, the kind of dim that a room might be in if the lamp was burning low and nearly out. She waited. The creak came again, then stopped, then nothing for a long time, then footsteps, retreating, going back the way they came. Eleanor stood in the study doorway in the near dark and listened to the retreat of those footsteps and thought about the specific skill required to navigate around the creaking boards in a hallway of a house you weren't supposed to know well. She stood there for another 2 minutes. Then she walked to the front room, made enough noise to be heard by anyone still in the house, and went to her room with the 2 documents folded inside her coat. She told Caleb after breakfast the next morning, in the yard rather than the house, because she'd started thinking about which rooms had been recently visited by people who moved quietly. She showed him the letter first. He read it standing in the early light, and she watched his face do what faces do when they find something they'd needed and had given up looking for. A kind of controlled relief that doesn't entirely succeed at being controlled. "My father kept copies of everything," he said softly. "I know. I could see that from the organization." Eleanor waited. "Look at the other one." He opened the handwritten agreement. She watched him read it a second time, more slowly. "This is what Victor told us was destroyed," he said. "Victor said the land office copy was destroyed. This is a separate copy kept by your father in his private files." She kept her voice steady. "Victor's lawyers probably believe it doesn't exist. If they knew about it, this house would have been searched long before now." Caleb looked up. "Has it been searched?" "I don't know. There was someone in the back hallway last night after I'd been in the study." She held his gaze. "Nothing appears to have been taken. But it means either we were lucky or they haven't found the study yet." The morning air moved around them. In the barn behind them, she could hear Hap starting the day's work, the solid, ordinary sounds of a ranch operating. Out past the east fence, the creek moved at its wrong level, thin and diminished. "I need to go back through the study," Eleanor said. "Make a complete inventory, and then we need to get these documents out of the house and somewhere safe before whoever is in that hallway realizes what's there." Caleb folded both documents with the careful, deliberate movements of a man making decisions as he does it. Where would be safe? "Roy Fenner's house," Eleanor said. "He's not connected to the main dispute. Victor has less reason to watch his property." She paused. "And we need to act on the false information test. We need to know for certain who it is." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the folded documents in his hands with the expression of someone holding something they almost didn't find, thinking about what that almost means. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need me to do." That afternoon, Eleanor did something she'd been building toward for a week, without fully acknowledging she was building toward it. She went to find Silas. He was at the corral, working a young horse that needed more patience than it was getting, though he had enough experience that his impatience didn't show up in the horse's behavior yet. Eleanor stood at the fence and watched, without comment, until he acknowledged her. "Going to tell me how to do this too?" he said. "No," she said. "I came to ask you something." He kept working. "Ask." "Victor Crow," she said. "What's he actually after?" Silas went still for just a moment. Then he kept working, but she'd seen it. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." She kept her voice without accusation. Just flat, just factual. "You've known Victor's family your whole life. You know how he works. And you know this isn't really about the water." The horse moved, and Silas moved with it, keeping the connection, the practiced ease of someone who'd spent more time with horses than with people, and found that preferable. "Water's worth plenty out here," he said finally. "Water is worth plenty," Eleanor agreed. "But Victor already has enough water. His eastern property has 3 springs that don't depend on CR7 at all. He's diverting this channel to hurt people, not to use it." She leaned on the fence rail. "Which means what he actually wants is the land. Once the cattle start dying, ranchers sell. At low prices to whoever is buying, and Victor is positioned to buy." Silas stopped the horse. He stood in the middle of the corral for a moment with the lead rope in his hand and his back to her. Then he turned. His face was doing something complicated. Not guilt exactly. Something older than guilt. Something that had been sitting with him longer than the current situation. "How long have you known?" he said. And by the question's shape, by what it assumed, Eleanor understood that she was right. "Long enough," she said. She kept her voice very level. "How long has he been paying you?" The corral was quiet. The young horse stood and blew air and waited to be told what to do next. "Since before Caleb's wife died," Silas said. "It came out without the performance of confession, just a fact being released from the place he'd been keeping it. Victor approached me before he even bought the property, said he was interested in the region, wanted someone to tell him how things worked." He stopped. "I told myself it was information, just information, nothing that would hurt anyone. But it became more than information. It always does." He said it with the flat exhaustion of someone who has known a thing for a long time and is tired of knowing it. "I told him about the ledger discrepancy. I told him when Caleb started asking questions about the water, and I told him about the meeting with Fenner and the others." He looked at Eleanor directly, and it was the most honest look he'd given her since she'd arrived. "I didn't tell him about you." Eleanor held that for a moment. "Why not?" "Because I hadn't figured you out yet." He looked down at the lead rope in his hands. "And because, whatever you are, you're not nothing. And I've spent enough years reporting on people who weren't nothing and watching Victor use that to grind them down." He paused. "I'm tired of it." Eleanor was quiet. She was thinking about Caleb, about the meeting, about the false information test she'd been planning, about what the right move was when the situation stopped being what you expected. "Silas," she said, "you still have Victor's trust?" He looked up. "If you were to tell him something, specifically what I told you to tell him, he'd believe it, because he has no reason not to trust you yet." The horse moved. Silas settled it automatically. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking you have a chance to do something with what you know," Eleanor said. "Not to make it right. That's not how this works. but to be useful in the direction of something better than what you've been useful for. He was quiet for a long time. The afternoon light was moving, the shadows stretching eastward, the day using up its hours the way days do without consulting anyone about whether they're ready. "Tell me what to say to him," Silas said. And Eleanor, who had spent 11 months carrying the weight of a plan she'd had to hold alone, told him. That night she sat with Caleb in the office, and she put everything on the desk between them. The survey copies, the Martin Crowe letter, the handwritten agreement from the back of the drawer, and then, last, the paper-wrapped bundle from the bottom of her bag. She set it on the desk and didn't open it immediately. She looked at him. "My name is Eleanor Crowe," she said. "Victor is my half-brother." The office was very quiet. The lamp burned. Somewhere in the house, a board contracted in the cooling night. Caleb looked at her across the desk. He looked at her with the full attention of a man who is deciding in real time how to respond to something that has upended the structure of his current understanding. He was very still. She'd noticed that about him. He went still when he was thinking rather than moving, the opposite of how a lot of men process difficult information. She told him. She told him about their father, about the estate, about Victor's manipulation of the inheritance, a familiar story done through forged documents, and a series of legal maneuvers so complex that by the time she understood what had happened, the money and the property were gone, and Victor was gone with them, 3 steps ahead and not looking back. She told him about Chicago, about the office, about the files she'd taken that night from the clerks who were destroying them. She told him about 11 months of careful accumulation, the bank records, the forged deeds, the testimonies she'd gathered from 2 men in Kansas who were willing to speak on paper about what Victor had done to their property claims. She told him about seeing his advertisement, about the calculation she'd made and why she'd made it. She told him all of it, not cleanly, not in order. She caught herself going back to correct things, to add context, to make sure he understood the parts that might otherwise look like deception rather than strategy. She was not a smooth narrator of her own story. She never had been. When she finished, the silence was the longest they'd sat in together. Caleb looked at the wrapped bundle on the desk. "Those are the documents." "Yes." "All of it." "Enough of it. With what you have from your father's study and the county survey records, there's enough to take to a territorial judge on the water injunction and enough to take to the federal land office on the fraud charges." She paused. "The fraud charges are the larger thing. The water is what's hurting you now, but the fraud is what puts Victor away." Caleb was quiet again. She waited. "You came here to use my ranch," he said finally. Not angry. She couldn't find anger in it, which surprised her, which she hadn't fully allowed herself to expect. "To use my situation as a base while you built a case." "Yes," she said, "and you married me to do it. I married you because I needed time and cover and a reason to be in this region without Victor noticing me. And because your ranch was already in his crosshairs and I thought I might be able to help with that while I did what I came to do." She held his gaze. "I didn't plan to care about what happened to it. That part wasn't in the plan." He was silent for a very long time. "Eleanor Crowe," he said. "That was my name before. Eleanor Voss was my mother's name. I've used it since I was 17. He looked at the desk. At everything laid out on it, the accumulated evidence of 11 months and a plan that had brought her to Wyoming and into this house and into this situation that was no longer purely strategic. "Is any of it a lie?" he said. "The cooking, the ledgers, the kitchen, last night in the study." He looked up. "Was any of that a performance?" She thought about the bread from the starter she'd kept alive across 2,000 miles. She thought about the accounts and the discrepancies she'd actually wanted to find. She thought about standing in the dark hallway listening to retreating footsteps and feeling something that was not just tactical concern. "No," she said. "None of that." He looked at her. He was doing the calibration she'd watched him do since the first day, that steady, internal measuring. Only this time it was measuring something much larger, and the stakes of getting it wrong were correspondingly higher. "All right," he said finally. She wasn't sure what the all right covered. She didn't ask. She thought it covered enough for tonight, and tonight was what they had. She reached over and picked up the wrapped bundle. She opened it and spread the documents across the desk, and began, in the lamplight, to show him what she'd been carrying all this time, and what it meant, and what they were going to do with it. Silas rode out to Victor's property the next morning with the information Eleanor had given him, and he rode out early enough that the frost was still on the grass and his breath was visible in the cold air, and he hated every mile of it in a way he hadn't hated the previous 3 years of the same errand. The difference, he'd decided somewhere between the corral and the main road, was that he'd told himself a story for 3 years. The story was that what he gave Victor was small. Operational details, scheduling information, the kind of thing that didn't directly hurt anyone. He'd been careful about what that story required him not to examine too closely. Eleanor Voss, Eleanor Crow, whatever her name was, had examined it for him in about 4 minutes of flat, direct conversation, and the story hadn't survived the examination. He didn't know yet what he was going to do about that beyond what she'd asked him to do this morning. One thing at a time. He'd learned that from horses, if not from the rest of his life. Victor's property was 6 miles east and up into the ridge country where the land got rockier and less forgiving and the grass grew in patches rather than continuously. The house was newer than it looked like it was trying to be. Victor had built it to suggest established money, the kind of place that had been there for generations, but the timber was still too clean and the foundation too even, and you could tell if you'd grown up in this region what was old and what was performing oldness. Silas had grown up in this region. One of Victor's men met him at the gate. The man's name was Chard, and he had the particular blankness of someone paid not to have opinions about things. "He's expecting you," Chard said, which meant Victor had been told Silas was coming, which meant someone had watched him leave the ranch. Silas filed that away with the particular discomfort of understanding, for the first time clearly, that Victor's observation of Black Ridge went both ways, that Silas himself had been watched while he was doing the watching. Victor was in his office, a room at the front of the house that he'd furnished with the same performed establishment as the exterior. Heavy desk, territorial maps on the wall, a bookshelf with books arranged by size rather than subject, which was the bookshelf of someone who wanted to appear to read rather than someone who actually did. Silas noticed that now in a way he hadn't previously, which was what happened when a woman spent 4 minutes dismantling your capacity for self-deception. "Silas." Victor didn't stand. He gestured at the chair across the desk. "Sit down. Tell me." Silas sat. He held his hat in his hands and said what Eleanor had told him to say, that Caleb had found nothing useful in the county records, that the survey books had been unhelpful, that Eleanor had come back from Harwick quiet, and that Caleb had been drinking more than usual since. He said it all steadily, in the tone he always used for this, and he watched Victor's face absorb it with the expression of a man receiving good news he'd expected but is still pleased to have confirmed. "And the woman?" Victor said. He said it casually, the way people say things they're actually most interested in. "She's managing the kitchen," Silas said. "Cooking for the hands. Seems like she's trying to make herself useful enough that Caleb keeps her on." He paused, the pause Eleanor had told him to include, the pause that makes information seem like it costs something to give. "She seems ordinary." Victor nodded slowly. He was looking at the map on the wall rather than at Silas, which was either because he was thinking or because he'd stopped needing to look at Silas when they talked, and Silas wasn't sure which of those was more unsettling. "The dam will be operable in 8 days, Victor said. "Once it is, I'll have the County Water Authority validate the diversion as a legitimate modification of a contested waterway. By the time Whitmore gets a lawyer organized, the legal landscape will have shifted." He turned from the map. His eyes were the gray of old ice, the color of certainty. "He'll be looking at cattle losses within 2 weeks. Henderson the same." A slight pause. Waited. "Motivated sellers are cooperative sellers." Silas kept his face neutral. "You're buying them out." "I'm creating conditions under which they choose to sell." Victor picked up a pen and made a notation on the document in front of him. "There's a distinction." Silas stood, because if he sat much longer in that chair with that voice in his ears, making that distinction, he was going to say something that would ruin everything Eleanor had set in motion. "I'll get back," he said, "before I'm missed." He rode home faster than he'd ridden out. Eleanor was in the barn when he returned, not because she had barn work to do, but because the barn was the one place on the property where a conversation couldn't be overheard from the house. She'd figured that out on day 4 and had been using it accordingly. Silas told her everything Victor had said, in order, without editorializing. She listened and asked 2 questions, about the County Water Authority contact Victor had mentioned, and about the 8-day timeline. And when he'd finished, she was quiet for long enough that he started to wonder if he'd forgotten something. "He's going to move faster than I expected," she said finally. 8 days, Silas said, maybe less. He said 8, but he's probably planned for 6. She was looking at the back wall of the barn, past it, the way people look when they're seeing something that isn't in the room. "The County Water Authority. The contact he mentioned. Fitch," Silas said. "Gerald Fitch. He's the deputy water commissioner for this district. Victor's had him for about a year, near as I can tell. Hunting trips, that kind of thing." Eleanor absorbed that. "A corrupt deputy commissioner is manageable if we're already in front of a judge," she said. "If we're not, he's the thing that makes the dam legally defensible before we can challenge it." She looked at Silas. "We have to file before the dam is validated, before Fitch puts his name on any documentation." "How long does filing take?" "The injunction request is already drafted. Roy Fenner's lawyer is holding it pending the survey copies, which he has." She moved toward the barn door, then stopped. "Silas, did Victor say anything about me specifically? Ask anything?" He thought about it. "Said you seemed ordinary. Didn't push further than that." She nodded. The relief wasn't visible on her face, but he'd been reading people a long time and he caught it around the edges. "Good," she said. "That's the last window. Once the injunction is filed, he's going to start asking questions about this ranch that he hasn't been asking before. And once he starts asking them, someone's going to tell him who I am." She left the barn. Silas stood alone with the horses for a moment, in the particular quiet of a place where large animals breathe steadily and don't have opinions about what the people around them are doing. He'd spent a lot of his life in spaces like this one, and he generally found them clarifying. He thought about what she'd said, about the window, about what happened when Victor found out. He thought about what a man like Victor did when he discovered someone had been playing him. He unsaddled his horse with careful, practiced hands and thought about Eleanor Crow riding out alone into 8 days that were probably going to be 6. The injunction was filed on Tuesday. Roy Fenner's lawyer, a man named Caulfield who operated out of a 2-room office above the Harwick dry goods store and had the competent, unhurried manner of someone who has outlasted a lot of urgency, rode to the territorial courthouse in person and placed the filing before the duty clerk at 9 in the morning. By 2 in the afternoon, Victor Crow knew about it. Eleanor had expected that. Victor had people in Harwick the same way he had people everywhere he'd put resources, and a filing of that nature at the territorial courthouse was not a small event in a county this size. She'd planned the timing accordingly. The injunction filed in the morning, the supporting documentation already in Caulfield's possession, the certified survey copies, and the Martin Crow letter, and the handwritten agreement all formally logged as exhibits before Victor's lawyer in Cheyenne could be notified and respond. What she hadn't fully accounted for was how Victor would react when he understood the scope of what had been filed against him. She was in the kitchen when Caleb came in from the yard with the expression that meant something had changed. He'd been outside with Hap and Pete, and she'd been able to watch from the window without being obvious about it, and she'd seen the rider come in and speak to Caleb and the specific quality of Caleb's stillness as he listened. "Victor's men were at the creek line this morning," Caleb said. "All of them, not working, just there, standing on the bank looking at the property." Eleanor set down what she was holding. "How many men?" 7, maybe 8. She looked at the window. The yard was ordinary. Pete crossing toward the water trough, Hap visible near the fence line, the morning proceeding as mornings proceeded. "Is that all the writer said?" He said Victor's been sending messages since noon, to Fitch at the Water Authority, to Aldridge in Cheyenne. Caleb leaned against the doorframe. The news had taken something from his posture, some of the careful steadiness he maintained. And to 2 names the writer didn't recognize. Eleanor was quiet. She was thinking about the paper-wrapped bundle, which was no longer under her floorboards because she'd moved it to Roy Fenner's house 2 days ago, along with the documents from the study. She was thinking about the timing, the injunction filed this morning, Victor reacting this afternoon. The dam still potentially 8 days from operable, and the legal process moving at the speed of a territorial court, which was not a speed designed for emergencies. "He's going to do something before the court responds," she said. "The injunction hearing is scheduled for Thursday," Caleb said. "Thursday is 2 days from now. A lot can happen in 2 days if someone is motivated." She turned from the window. "I need to go to Roy's." "Tonight?" "Now. I need to go over the documentation with Caulfield and make sure everything is properly organized before the hearing. She was already untying her apron. And I need to talk to Caulfield about the fraud documents specifically. The water injunction is one thing, but if we can present the federal fraud evidence at the same hearing, can we do that? Combine them? Not formally, but we can make a representation to the judge that the water dispute is part of a larger pattern, and that the larger pattern is being referred to the federal land office. That changes the judge's context. She looked at Caleb directly. It changes what he thinks he's deciding. Caleb was quiet. He was doing the thing she'd come to recognize, not agreeing, not resisting, just running the possibilities with the careful, unglamorous competence of a man who had kept a ranch running through drought and debt and grief and was not, when it came down to it, afraid of difficult calculations. "Take Hap with you," he said. "I don't need—" Victor has 7 men at the creek line and 2 names the writer didn't recognize. He looked at her steadily. "Take Hap." She held the look for a moment. "All right," she said. She and Hap rode out at 3. Hap was a man who understood that some rides required conversation and some required quiet, and this was one he read correctly, so they covered the first 4 miles without speaking. It was Hap who saw the man on the ridge. He said nothing, just made a small sound and shifted his eyes in a direction without pointing, because pointing was not something you did when you were being watched. Eleanor looked. A rider, still, on the high ground above the south pasture, just watching. "Victor's?" she asked. "Don't know his horse," Hap said. "Don't know him." A pause. "But that's a good position for watching the road to Fenner's." Eleanor thought about the bundle at Roy's house, about the documents in Caulfield's office, about what Victor would do if he understood what she was carrying and where it was going. "Keep moving," she said. "Same pace." They kept moving. The rider on the ridge tracked them for half a mile, visible in her peripheral vision, and then was gone, dropped behind the ridgeline without apparent urgency, which was somehow worse than obvious pursuit. Obvious pursuit had a direction. Disappearance didn't. Roy Fenner met them at his door with the expression of a man who'd also been watching his ridgelines. "You saw him," he said. "South pasture high ground," Eleanor said. "I've had 2 this afternoon, 1 south, 1 east." Roy stepped back from the door. "Come in." Caulfield was already there, which meant Roy had anticipated this meeting, which meant Roy was paying closer attention to the tactical situation than Eleanor had fully credited. She revised her estimate of Roy Fenner upward as she came through the door. The documents were on Roy's kitchen table, organized in the careful way of someone who understood their legal weight. The certified survey copies, the Martin Crow letter, the handwritten agreement, and beside them, the contents of Eleanor's bundle, the Chicago documents, organized now into 3 categories: the forged property deeds, the bank transaction records, and the 2 signed witness statements from Kansas. Caulfield looked at this full spread for a long moment. He was a man in his 50s, experienced enough to have seen a lot of legal situations and developed the ability to assess them without performing the assessment. "This is more than a water injunction," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. She sat down. "What I need to know is how to use the federal material without waiting for a separate federal filing. The injunction hearing is Thursday. If the judge understands what's in these documents, I can't submit them as evidence in a water injunction proceeding," Caulfield said. "Different jurisdiction, different evidentiary standard." He picked up the Kansas witness statements and read them carefully. "But I can make representations to the court, and I can file a concurrent notice with the federal land office today, by telegraph, which means by Thursday morning there will be an active federal inquiry, which changes what the territorial judge thinks he's looking at." "Aldridge will try to suppress it," Eleanor said. "He'll try. He won't succeed in a same-day suppression." Caulfield set the statements down. The combined weight of this, the survey records, the handwritten agreement, the Martin Crow letter, and a concurrent federal inquiry. Aldridge is going to walk into that courtroom Thursday and discover his client's position is significantly weaker than he calculated it to be, Roy said, from where he was standing near the window. "Victor's not going to wait for Thursday." Everyone looked at him. "He's had men watching this road since noon," Roy said. "He knows she came here. He knows Caulfield is here." He turned from the window. "Victor's approach, everything I've seen of it, is to act before the legal situation settles against him. The dam, the water authority contact, the way he timed all of this. He paused. He's going to do something tonight or tomorrow that changes the conditions. Caulfield looked at Eleanor. The documents, he said. Not copies, the originals. The originals are here, Eleanor said. They need to not be here, Caulfield said. If something happens to these documents before Thursday. I have copies of the federal documents, Eleanor said. I made copies in Chicago before I left. They're in a law office in Cheyenne. I sent them there 6 months ago, registered mail. She'd told no one this. Not even in her own private accounting had she fully admitted how long she'd been preparing for the possibility of losing what she carried. The copies aren't as complete as the originals, but they're enough to establish the pattern. The room was quiet for a moment. You planned for this, Roy said. I planned for the possibility. She looked at Caulfield. File the federal notice by telegraph tonight. Organize the water injunction materials for Thursday. And we need a plan for what Victor does between now and then. What Victor did was move faster than 6 days and faster than Eleanor's worst estimate of tonight. He moved the next morning, just before dawn, with the particular efficiency of someone who has been planning a contingency and pulled it forward. Eleanor was awake when it started. She'd been sleeping lightly for 3 nights, a habit she'd developed during the worst months of the Chicago period. When she'd learned that her body would do the vigilance her mind was too tired to sustain. She heard something or felt something in the air of the house that was different, and she was at her window before she was fully conscious of having decided to move. She saw the fire first, not at the house, at the equipment barn, the east side structure that held the haying equipment and grain stores. And the fire was not new. It had been burning long enough to be visible from the window as something serious, something past the early stage where it might be stopped. She was out of the room before the shout from the yard reached her. The yard became chaos in the way that ranch yards become chaos when fire is involved. Men running from the bunkhouse, Caleb already there, the pump at the water trough going, a bucket chain forming with the ragged efficiency of people who know what to do but are doing it at 3 in the morning when their brains are half asleep and their hands aren't working at full speed. Eleanor went to the main house first, not toward the fire. She went to her room and she went under the loose floorboard that was now empty. The documents were at Roy's, and confirmed the emptiness and straightened up. Then she went to Caleb's office and looked at the desk and the drawers, which were as they should be. Then she went to the back door and out into the yard. Pete was beside her almost immediately, appearing from somewhere in the chaos. The east barn, he said. Someone said it. I know, Eleanor said. Is everyone out of the bunkhouse? Everyone's accounted for. Pete paused, and she could see him organizing himself, 18 or 19 years old, and doing it better than men twice his age might have. Caleb told me to find you. I'm found. She looked at the fire. The east barn was gone, or going. The structure was not savable at this point. The question was containing it, so the main barn and the hay stores in the separate west outbuilding didn't catch. The men had figured that out, and the bucket chain was pointed right. Is the main barn secure? Hap's wetting it down. Good. She looked east, past the fire and the chaos, past the light the fire threw against the dark. Somewhere out there, men had ridden up to the east barn and done what they'd done and ridden away. Or hadn't ridden away. Pete, get back inside the bunkhouse and stay there. Don't come out without a weapon. He looked at her. Why? Because the fire is a distraction. She said it calmly because she needed him to hear it and not panic on it. This is Victor moving the situation before Thursday. The fire is what he wants us to be looking at. She turned back toward the house. Go. She found Caleb at the pump, working it with Garrett and Dutch, his shirt dark with water and effort. She put her hand on his arm briefly and he turned. East barn is a loss, he said. We're saving the main barn. Good. Caleb, Victor moved the timeline. This is about Thursday. She kept her voice under the noise of the fire and the shouting. He wants us overwhelmed before the hearing. Equipment destroyed, men occupied, you exhausted. I want you to walk into that courthouse Thursday, having spent 2 nights without sleep managing a crisis. Caleb's face was lit on one side by the fire. The expression on it was tired and controlled and genuinely angry in the way of a man who has been patient longer than patience warranted. What do we do? You send someone to Roy's tonight, now. Get the documents moved to Caulfield's office. That's the safest location we have, inside a legal office under attorney privilege. She looked at the fire. And you need to send someone to Harwick tonight to tell Caulfield what happened, in case Victor has planned something else for tomorrow. I'll send Hap and Silas together, Caleb said. He looked at her. You trust Silas? I trust Silas to understand that he's already past the point where Victor's protection means anything, she said carefully. That's not the same as trust exactly, but it's enough for tonight. Caleb nodded and moved. Eleanor stayed and watched the East Barn burn itself down and thought about contingencies, about what else Victor might have planned, about the documents safe in Caulfield's office by tomorrow morning if Hap and Silas rode fast. Garrett appeared beside her. He was a ranch hand she'd assessed as Silas's man from the first week, part of the orbit she'd been watching. He stood beside her looking at the fire and said, without looking at her, I heard things. Working near Victor's property last year, before Silas asked me to report back. Eleanor looked at him. I know what I was doing, he said. His voice was young. He was younger than she'd thought, not much older than Pete. I told Silas things, and Silas told Victor. He stopped. I didn't know it went further than Silas. What did you hear? Eleanor said. Near Victor's property. He had men talking about the properties he was targeting. Black Ridge, Henderson, 3 others. They were talking about the timeline. Always the same phrase, by first snow. He wanted all 5 properties in contract by first snow. He looked at the fire. There's a buyer. Someone from back east. Victor's been promising them the land package since spring. Eleanor was very still. A buyer. Someone with money for the whole thing, all 5 properties, put together. The young man shifted. I don't know who. I just heard the phrase, the buyer wants them contiguous. All 5 properties share a boundary. Someone wants the whole belt of land. Eleanor thought about that, about the scale of it, the premeditation. This wasn't opportunistic, wasn't Victor being acquisitive out of habit. This was a commissioned acquisition. Someone had hired Victor to assemble this land, and Victor was executing it on a deadline, which explained the acceleration, explained the dam and the fire, explained the precision of the timeline she'd been struggling to account for. Thank you, Garrett, she said. Go help with the bucket line. She stood for another moment in the firelight and thought about eastern buyers and contiguous properties and land packages assembled by first snow. Then she went inside and she sat at Caleb's desk and she wrote 3 letters by lamplight. To Caulfield, to the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne, and to a lawyer in Chicago who owed her a professional courtesy and had access to the kind of financial records that tracked large land acquisition transactions on the eastern market. She wrote them fast and without false starts, because she knew what she needed to say. When she was done, she sealed them and set them beside the lamp and sat back in the chair. The fire outside was settling. The shouts had reduced to steady working voices, the sound of men who have stopped fighting an emergency and started managing an aftermath. The East Barn was rubble and ash. The equipment in it was lost. The grain was lost. The ranch had taken damage it could recover from but would feel through the winter. Victor had done what he'd planned to do, and it had hurt, and he would call it a success. He didn't know about the buyer information. He didn't know that the scope of what Eleanor was building had just expanded from a regional water dispute to a documented conspiracy to fraudulently acquire 5 properties for an undisclosed Eastern purchaser. He didn't know that she'd moved the documents the day before, on instinct and preparation, and he still didn't know who she was. Caleb came in at 5 in the morning, smoke-dark and worn down, and found her at his desk with 3 sealed letters. He looked at her. You should sleep, he said. In an hour. She pushed the letters toward him. These need to go out at first light. The one for Caulfield needs to be in his hands before 8. She looked at him. Did Hap and Silas get away clean? Rode out an hour ago. He sat down in the chair across the desk, his wife's chair, the one she'd put where she could look out the window, the one Eleanor had been unconsciously avoiding until tonight. He sat in it without appearing to notice. Eleanor, are you all right? She looked at him across the desk in the early gray of a morning that would be full light in another hour, and she answered the question honestly rather than efficiently. I'm tired, she said. I've been tired for 11 months, and I expected to feel less tired when things started moving, but I feel more tired, which I should have anticipated. She paused. But yes, I'm all right. He looked at her for a long moment. He reached across the desk and put his hand briefly on the sealed letters. not picking them up, just acknowledging them. "My father would have liked you," he said. It wasn't a romantic thing. It was specific and honest, the kind of statement men make when they mean something by it and don't dress it up. He respected people who kept good records. Eleanor looked at the letters under his hand. "The feeling I have about your father," she said carefully, "is that he was trying to protect this ranch even after he was gone. He kept the correspondence. He kept the copy." She paused. He couldn't have known it would matter. He just knew that paper was the one thing that didn't lie. Caleb smiled. It was the first time she'd seen him do it, without it being a reflex or a social gesture. It was the real one, small and tired and entirely genuine. "He said that," Caleb said. "Exactly that. All my life." Eleanor gathered the letters and stood. Outside the Wyoming sky was going from black to the deep blue that came before proper dawn. The fire smell was in the air and would be for days. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he said. She went to her room and lay down and was asleep before she'd finished the thought she'd started. Thursday came cold and clear, the kind of Wyoming morning that has no patience for anything unfinished. Caleb drove. Eleanor sat beside him in her best dress, which was not a fine dress but was clean and pressed and said what it needed to say, that the woman wearing it understood the weight of where she was going. The certified documents were in a satchel between her feet. Caulfield had confirmed by messenger the night before that the federal telegraph notice had gone through, that the land office in Cheyenne had responded with an acknowledgement of inquiry, and that Aldridge had filed a motion to delay the hearing that the duty judge had already denied. Roy Fenner was waiting outside the courthouse with Henderson and young Pruitt. They stood together in the early light with the particular solidarity of people who have not planned to become a community but have become one anyway through the pressure of shared difficulty. Roy nodded when he saw Eleanor. She nodded back. Caulfield met them on the courthouse steps. He looked like a man who had not slept much but had used the sleeplessness productively. "Aldridge arrived an hour ago," he said quietly. "He brought 2 associates. Victor is not here in person." "He won't come himself," Eleanor said. "He never does when he's not certain of winning." Caulfield looked at her steadily. "Are we certain of winning?" "We're certain of being heard," she said. "That's what we came for." The hearing lasted 4 hours. Eleanor sat behind Caulfield at the petitioner's table and watched the territorial judge, a man named Harlan Voss, no relation, which struck her as the kind of coincidence that meant nothing but felt like something, work through the documentary record with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who understood that his job was to read what was actually in front of him rather than what the lawyers were trying to perform. Aldridge was skilled. She'd been told that, and he demonstrated it. He challenged the chain of custody on the handwritten agreement, questioned the relevance of Martin Crow's letter as hearsay, and made a persuasive argument that the county survey records established the natural course of the water, but not any private arrangement regarding its use. He was precise, and he was organized, and he kept his voice at the exact register of reasonable confidence without tipping into arrogance, which was the more dangerous form. Caulfield was quieter than Aldridge, and Eleanor thought, better. He let the document speak. He walked Judge Voss through the survey entry, the parcel registration, the easement terms as recorded, right to draw, not right to redirect. And he placed Martin Crow's letter not as proof of the agreement's terms, but as evidence that the agreement was understood by both parties in exactly the way Caleb had always maintained. He was building a picture rather than making an argument, and pictures were harder to dispute than arguments. When Caulfield made his representation regarding the concurrent federal inquiry, 3 sentences, carefully worded, informing the court that a related matter involving property acquisition irregularities was currently under active federal review, Aldridge objected immediately. Judge Voss overruled the objection with the brevity of a man who had already decided how he was going to handle that particular question. The 4 hours were not dramatic. That was the thing Eleanor hadn't fully communicated to Caleb, who sat beside her through it with his hands flat on his thighs and his jaw controlled. Legal proceedings were almost never dramatic. They were documentary. They were procedural. The drama was in what the paper said and whether the judge believed it, and that drama played out in silences and notations rather than in speeches. Judge Voss issued a temporary injunction halting further construction on the diversion dam pending a full water rights hearing to be scheduled within 30 days. He noted for the record that the easement terms as registered did not include redirection rights, and that the burden of proof in the full hearing would rest with the party claiming those rights, which was Victor. Aldridge's face showed nothing. That was its own kind of information. They were on the courthouse steps when Caulfield put his hand on Eleanor's arm and said quietly, "The federal inquiry. How complete is the documentation you sent to Cheyenne?" "Complete enough," she said. "I'd like to be involved," he said, "when it moves forward." She looked at him. "It will move forward. Not in 30 days, but it will move." He nodded. He shook Caleb's hand and Roy's and went back inside, because a man like Caulfield always had somewhere to be next. Roy stood on the steps with the clear air of the morning around him and looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man settling a private accounting. "Your idea," he said. "The survey records." "Your neighbor's letters," she said. "Pruitt's father. That's what made it unambiguous." Roy almost smiled. "We should have compared notes 3 years ago." "Victor was counting on you not to," Eleanor said. "That's how he operates. He keeps people separate. Individual grievances stay individual. He only loses when the individual grievances become collective evidence." Roy looked out at the street, at the ordinary commerce of a Wyoming county seat on an ordinary Thursday. "The federal case," he said. "The land package, the Eastern buyer. Will that come out?" "Yes." She was certain of that. The letter she'd sent to Chicago had gone to a lawyer who had already been building a parallel case against the Eastern financier for an unrelated matter, and when she'd laid out what Garrett had told her about the contiguous land package, the response had come back within 3 days. They had the buyer's name, they had the transaction records, and they were already interested. Victor's operation in Wyoming was not his only one. He had done this before, in Kansas and in Missouri, and the federal land office's interest in the Wyoming inquiry was larger than one county's water dispute. "It will come out," she said again. Roy nodded once. He went down the steps to his horse. The others followed. Victor Crow was arrested 7 weeks later. It was not a dramatic arrest. Federal marshals came to his property on a Tuesday morning with the warrant and the paperwork and the particular calm of men executing a process rather than making a point. Victor walked out of his house in his good coat and got into the marshal's wagon without apparent surprise and was taken to Cheyenne, where he sat in a cell and waited for Aldridge to arrive. And Aldridge arrived, but looked at the scope of the federal indictment and spent 2 hours reading it before he said anything at all. The diversion dam was dismantled by court order 2 weeks after the injunction, by Victor's own remaining men who were now working for wages that no one was paying, and the Eastern Channel returned to its natural course within a week. Caleb's cattle found the water again without being told to look. Eleanor heard about the arrest by letter. She was at Black Ridge when it came, in the kitchen, which was where she was most mornings, and she read the letter twice and then set it on the table and looked out the window at the October light on the grass. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd expected to, and she didn't. She felt tired, and then slowly, something that was quieter than triumph. A settling, like a weight carried so long that setting it down felt strange rather than relieving. Silas knocked on the kitchen door frame. He did that now, knocked before entering, which was a small change she had noticed and not commented on. "Word's out," he said. "Henderson's boy rode by." "I know," she said. He came in and poured himself coffee, which he'd also started doing, using the kitchen without apology, but also without the previous entitlement. He stood with the cup and looked at her. "You all right?" "I'm trying to figure out what all right feels like now," she said honestly. He drank his coffee. "Feels like a Tuesday morning," he said. "I think that's all it gets to be." She thought about that. "That's probably right," she said. "What?" Caleb came home from the East Field at midday and found her on the porch. He'd been checking the fence line near where the creek had returned to its proper channel, the first full week of genuine water flow since before he could account for the start of Victor's interference. He was dirty from the work, and his boots were wet from the creek, and he looked better than he'd looked in months, not because anything was resolved neatly, but because the specific weight of ongoing crisis had lifted, and what remained was ordinary difficulty, which a man like Caleb Whitmore was equipped to carry. He sat on the step below her, and they both looked at the October land. "Caulfield says the full water rights hearing is a formality now," he said. "With Victor facing federal charges, Aldridge withdrew the easement modification claim." "I know," Eleanor said. A pause. The eastern buyer has been identified. He's under investigation in 2 other states. Another pause. Roy told Henderson, Henderson told Pruitt, Pruitt told everyone else. The whole story came out. Most of it, Eleanor said. Caleb looked at his wet boots. People in town are asking about you, he said. About who you are. The real version. She'd been expecting this. The story that was spreading through the county was the water injunction story, the fraud case, the arrest. And at the center of it, inescapably, was the woman from Black Ridge Ranch who had filed the county survey request and produced the documents that changed the legal landscape. Eleanor Crow had not stayed hidden. Eleanor Crow, it turned out, could not have stayed hidden and also done what needed doing. Those 2 things were incompatible, and she'd known it and done it anyway. What are you telling them? She asked. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I'm telling them my wife came to Wyoming with a plan, and it turned out to be a better plan than anything I had. He glanced at her sidelong. Is that accurate? More or less. I'm leaving out the part where I didn't know about the plan. That seems wise. He looked at the land again. The grass was brown now at the edges, October doing its seasonal work, the long Wyoming winter not far behind. The east field that had been drying through the summer had begun its slow recovery. Not dramatic, not overnight, just the quiet persistence of land that has water again doing what land does when you give it what it needs. Eleanor looked at it too and thought about what it meant to be somewhere. Not visiting, not stationed, not positioned. Somewhere. She'd been moving for 11 months with the particular forward-facing focus of a person executing a plan, and plans by their nature pointed ahead, at the next step, the next document, the next legal filing. She hadn't looked sideways much, hadn't looked at where she actually was. She was here, this porch, this ranch, this man sitting on the step below her with wet boots and a tiredness that was finally, slowly, the ordinary kind. She had not come here to stay. She had come here to finish something. But finishing something and leaving were not the same thing, and somewhere in the 11 months of planning she had not accounted for the possibility that she might arrive at the end and find that the place she'd chosen for its strategic value had quietly become, without her permission, the place she wanted to be. That was not a comfortable thing to admit. She was not naturally comfortable with things she hadn't planned for. Caleb, she said. He looked up. I didn't come here to build a life, she said. I want to be honest about that. I came here to finish what Victor took from my family and to help stop what he was doing to yours. Those things are done now, or close enough to done, that the rest is other people's work. She looked at her hands in her lap. What happens next isn't something I planned. He was quiet for a long time. Below them, Pete crossed the yard carrying something, gave a brief wave in their direction, and kept going. The ordinary life of a working ranch proceeding on its own ordinary terms, indifferent to the weight of the conversation on the porch. Eleanor, Caleb said, you've been here 3 months. You've fed my men, gone through my father's papers, ridden to a county courthouse, stayed up through a fire, and gone 8 rounds with the most effective liar in the territory. He paused. Whatever you came here to do, you did it from inside this place. You were part of it. He looked at her directly, the same steady look he'd been giving her since the train station, though it had learned more about her in 3 months than it had anticipated having to learn. That's not a visit. She held the look. It required something from her accepting it, the same way accepting the bread going first from the tray had required something. The small acknowledgement that a thing you'd done had mattered to someone. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I haven't found that, he said. You will, she said. He almost smiled. Probably, he said. That was it. That was all of it. Not a declaration, not a resolution, just 2 people on a porch in October, in the plain and necessary truth of their situation, deciding without ceremony that the situation was one they were going to continue in together. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves as significant. They arrive like Tuesday mornings, without drama, without preparation, asking nothing except that you be present enough to notice them. Eleanor Voss, who had been Eleanor Crow once, and carried that name now alongside the other in the private accounting of herself, had spent 11 months learning that the things worth doing were rarely the things that went according to plan. The plan was a door. What mattered was what you found on the other side of it. She had found a ranch that needed someone to give a damn about it. She had found a man who was better than he let himself believe. She had found Unexpectedly, a place in the world that did not require her to be smaller or quieter or simpler than she was. People would say later, in the way that regions develop their histories and their legends, that Eleanor Whitmore had saved Black Ridge Ranch. That was true as far as it went. But what it left out was everything that was harder to put into a story. The bread made from a starter kept alive across 2,000 miles. The ledger checked at midnight. The quiet conversation in a barn with a man trying to decide what kind of person he still wanted to be. The things that don't look like saving anything when you're doing them. The creek ran full in the eastern channel. The Eastfield would come back by spring. The work ahead was ordinary and enormous, and hers. She stayed.